Ladies and gentlemen, in the shadows of 1920s New York, where speakeasies thrived and violence ruled the streets, one man rose above all others, a ruthless gangster known as Joe Masseria. Feared by friends and enemies alike, his name became synonymous with power, betrayal, and a bloody struggle that would change the face of organized crime forever. But who was Joe Masseria, and how did his reign come to an explosive end? Giuseppe Masseria, later known as Joe the Boss Masseria, was born in the Sicilian town of Mafia in 1886, during a time when southern Italy was plagued by poverty, political instability, and rampant organized crime. The Sicilian Mafia had already established a strong influence in the region, and young men like Masseria were exposed early to a world where survival often depended on cunning, strength, and strategic violence. These formative years in Sicily, where corruption and silence were part of daily life, shaped the instincts and worldview that would later define his criminal career. In the early 1900s, Masseria's family joined the massive wave of Italian immigrants who left their homeland in search of a better life in America. Settling in New York City's overcrowded Lower East Side, the young Masseria entered a brutal urban jungle where opportunity came not through hard work and education, but through force, intimidation, and connections to the underworld. The streets were ruled by ethnic gangs, and tensions between Italian, Irish, and Jewish criminal elements were constant. For poor immigrants like Masseria, the American dream was out of reach, so he chose an alternative path. Rather than take on low-paying factory work or manual labor, Masseria found his way into the city's growing Italian criminal underworld. He quickly gained a reputation for violence and ambition, aligning himself with older mafia figures who had brought the Sicilian code of omerta, the vow of silence and loyalty, across the Atlantic. By the 1910s, he had already been arrested multiple times, including for burglary and assault. But instead of discouraging him, these early brushes with the law only reinforced his desire to climb higher and take control of his own destiny in the only way he believed possible, through crime. His early years in America were marked by calculated moves, bloody power plays, and an ability to win allies through both fear and respect. It was in this crucible of immigrant struggle and criminal opportunity that Joe Masseria began his transformation from a street-level thug into a future mafia boss. The turning point in Joe Masseria's criminal ascent came with the arrival of Prohibition in 1920, a nationwide ban on the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. What was intended as a moral reform quickly became the greatest gift ever handed to organized crime. The illegal alcohol trade exploded almost overnight, and those with connections, muscle, and street-level influence were the first to seize control of the underground economy. Masseria, already embedded in New York's criminal circles, was uniquely positioned to capitalize on this chaotic new opportunity. As alcohol vanished from legal storefronts, it began flowing through the hidden veins of the city, speakeasies, back alleys, and secret warehouses. Masseria organized smuggling networks that brought liquor from Canada and the Caribbean, using bribed customs officials and corrupt police to protect shipments. He also established relationships with corrupt politicians and union leaders, ensuring that his operations would run with minimal interference. His network of influence stretched through key neighborhoods in Manhattan, especially the Lower East Side and Little Italy, where loyalty to the old Sicilian traditions gave him a dependable base of support. But Masseria didn't stop at bootlegging. He expanded into illegal gambling operations, setting up underground betting houses, card games, and lotteries that pulled in millions of dollars. His extortion rackets targeted local businesses, demanding protection money in exchange for safety, a classic mafia tactic that guaranteed steady income while reinforcing fear and control. Masseria's growing empire operated with military precision. He surrounded himself with loyal enforcers, many of them fellow Sicilians, who enforced his rule with brutal efficiency. Rivals who dared encroach on his territory were either intimidated into submission or eliminated without hesitation. Unlike earlier street gangs, Masseria's organization had hierarchy, discipline, and vision. He wasn't just a thug, he was becoming a boss in the true mafia sense. His ability to manage operations across various illegal industries, while keeping law enforcement at bay, earned him widespread recognition in the underworld. Newspapers began referring to him as Joe the Boss, a title that reflected both his power and the fear he inspired. Through strategic violence, clever alliances, and a mastery of prohibition economics, Joe Masseria was no longer just a criminal. He was becoming one of the most powerful mafia figures in all of New York. By the mid-1920s, Joe Masseria had transformed himself from a Sicilian immigrant street tough into a towering figure within the New York underworld. His rise was not accidental. It was built on a mix of cunning, brutality, and strategic maneuvering. As his criminal empire grew, so did his influence over various mafia factions across the city. While other gang leaders jostled for power within their neighborhoods or boroughs, Masseria sought something far greater: centralized control of all Italian-American organized crime in New York. This ambition didn't go unnoticed. His enemies saw him as a tyrant, but his followers revered him as a symbol of raw power and old-world authority. The press, ever eager to label figures in the growing world of organized crime, began referring to him as Joe the Boss. The title wasn't just a nickname. It was a public recognition of his emerging role as the most dominant mafia figure in the city. Among his peers, it carried weight. To be the boss among a community of ruthless criminals meant you commanded not just respect, but fear. What set Masseria apart was his ability to enforce loyalty across fragmented mafia crews, many of whom had long-standing rivalries based on regional ties from back in Italy. These Sicilian factions often mistrusted each other, but Masseria demanded unity under his rule. He operated not just with brute strength, but with a strategic mind, often manipulating one group against another to eliminate threats and consolidate power. If a gang refused to bend the knee, Masseria made examples of their leaders, sometimes through public assassinations, other times through financial ruin. He didn't rule from the shadows, either. Joe Masseria made his presence known. He frequented clubs, restaurants, and political functions, dressed in fine suits, and always surrounded by bodyguards. He projected the image of a kingpin, untouchable, untamed, and unchallenged. Even legitimate businessmen and politicians began to approach him with respect, knowing his influence could make or break their interests. Through calculated acts of violence and an ever-expanding network of allies, Masseria extended his reach into labor unions, construction contracts, illegal casinos, and city politics. His control of Italian neighborhoods in Manhattan and Brooklyn was near absolute. Anyone conducting business in his territory, legal or illegal, was expected to pay tribute. His soldiers collected protection money, enforced deals, and kept rivals in check. The name, Joe the Boss, soon became synonymous with mafia power in New York. It was whispered in fear and backroom deals, printed in newspaper headlines, and even acknowledged in law enforcement circles. His dominance wasn't just over a single gang. It was over an entire underworld ecosystem made up of smugglers, killers, fixers, and brokers of vice. By the late 1920s, Joe Masseria's grip over New York's Italian-American criminal underworld was strong, but it was not uncontested. Beneath the surface of his empire, a dangerous tension had begun to boil. While Masseria had managed to consolidate power across various mafia factions, his leadership style, rooted in fear, favoritism, and old-world loyalties, began to breed resentment, especially among younger and more ambitious mobsters who viewed him as outdated, greedy, and increasingly paranoid. At the heart of this growing unrest was another powerful figure from Sicily, Salvatore Maranzano, a sharp-minded, traditionalist mafioso who had arrived in America from the town of Castellamare del Golfo. Like Masseria, Maranzano had deep roots in the old Sicilian mafia, but he brought with him a more hierarchical, almost militaristic vision of how organized crime should be run. Unlike the loosely structured gangs of New York, Maranzano wanted to implement a system modeled after ancient Roman principles, with himself as the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. The brewing rivalry between Masseria and Maranzano escalated into a full-scale conflict that would become known as the Castellammarese War, named after Maranzano's Sicilian hometown and the faction of Castellammarese immigrants who backed him. This wasn't a simple turf war. It was a brutal power struggle that reshaped the entire American mafia. Over the course of nearly 2 years, from 1929 to 1931, Both sides unleashed a wave of targeted killings, ambushes, and betrayals across the city. Masseria, determined to hold on to power, responded with a ruthless crackdown on suspected traitors and rivals. He believed that any sign of weakness would lead to his downfall. His leadership became increasingly erratic, and he began demanding absolute loyalty from his underlings, forcing many of them to choose sides in a conflict they neither started nor wanted. Trust became a rare commodity in the underworld, and whispers of betrayal were often answered with bullets. The streets of New York became killing grounds as assassins roamed freely, executing orders from both camps. High-profile murders rocked the city, including the elimination of prominent mobsters, some of whom were gunned down in broad daylight. Law enforcement struggled to make sense of the bloodshed, often baffled by the Mafia's strict code of silence and the complexity of its internal politics. At the core of this storm stood Masseria, clinging to his title as Joe the Boss, while fending off constant threats from Maranzano's rising faction. His every move was watched. His inner circle became smaller and more secretive. He believed that victory in this war would secure his place as the undisputed ruler of all Italian-American organized crime. But the war was taking its toll. Allies were disappearing. Soldiers were switching sides. And new players, clever, young, and ambitious, were beginning to plot from within his own ranks. Joe Masseria's reign was defined by an unflinching code: obey without question or face deadly consequences. His rise to power had not been built on charm or diplomacy, but on fear, violence, and a relentless drive to crush anyone who stood in his way. As the self-proclaimed boss of bosses in New York's Mafia world, Masseria enforced his rule with a brutal efficiency that earned him a reputation as one of the most dangerous men in organized crime. His ruthlessness was legendary in both the criminal underworld and law enforcement circles. Rivals who opposed him rarely lasted long. Whether it was through direct assassination, staged accidents, or sudden disappearances, Masseria made sure his enemies were removed permanently. He didn't just defeat opponents. He sent a message through their fates. Bodies turning up in alleyways, bullet-riddled cars, and unsolved murders became part of the landscape under his rule. Inside his own organization, Masseria ruled with an iron fist. Loyalty was not optional. It was demanded, and betrayal was considered worse than death. Associates and soldiers were expected to adhere to his commands without hesitation. He often tested his men's loyalty through unpredictable demands, sometimes forcing them to choose between their own survival and carrying out a dangerous hit. Those who flinched or hesitated were quickly replaced or dealt with. But Masseria's style of leadership also bred a culture of paranoia. His inner circle was composed of men who feared him more than they respected him. He distrusted nearly everyone around him and became increasingly controlling as his empire expanded. He was known to micromanage even minor operations, insisting on having the final word in decisions that should have been left to his lieutenants. This obsessive need for control reflected both his ambition and his deep insecurity. Moreover, his methods often alienated the younger generation of gangsters who were rising in influence during the Prohibition era. These younger mobsters, men like Charles Lucky Luciano, saw Masseria as a relic of the past. His obsession with Sicilian traditions, his resistance to working with non-Italians, and his stubborn refusal to adapt to the modern structure of organized crime created rifts within his own camp. Nevertheless, for a time, his ruthlessness paid off. His enemies feared him, his territory expanded, and his name became synonymous with Mafia power. The phrase Joe the Boss carried weight not just in New York, but across the country, as Italian-American gangs in other cities looked to him as a symbol of authority and tradition. But this dominance came at a price: a growing list of enemies, both inside and outside his circle, and a fragile empire held together not by trust or vision, but by violence and intimidation. As the criminal landscape of America evolved during the 1920s and early 1930s, a generational divide began to take shape within the Italian-American Mafia. On one side stood traditionalists like Joe Masseria, steeped in the old-world codes of loyalty, bloodlines, and absolute authority. On the other stood a younger, sharper breed of mobsters, pragmatic, Americanized, and increasingly disillusioned with the rigid, autocratic rule of bosses like Masseria. At the forefront of this new wave was Charles Lucky Luciano, a brilliant and ambitious gangster who would one day revolutionize organized crime. But before that transformation could happen, he had to survive Masseria. Masseria's leadership was rooted in Sicilian customs and an outdated belief that only those born in Sicily could be trusted with real power. He often refused to work with non-Italians and dismissed the potential of collaborating with other ethnic crime syndicates. This narrow, exclusionary mindset clashed directly with the vision of Luciano, who saw immense profit and long-term stability in building alliances with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, as well as Irish criminal networks. To Luciano and his peers, crime was not just about muscle or tradition. It was about efficiency, adaptability, and making money. Luciano had once served loyally under Masseria, and for a time, their alliance seemed mutually beneficial. Masseria provided protection and power. Luciano brought intelligence and connections. But it didn't take long for Luciano to see the cracks in Masseria's leadership. The boss was increasingly paranoid, prone to micromanaging every detail, and more focused on defending his title than growing his empire. He waged unnecessary wars, resisted change, and surrounded himself with aging loyalists who were out of touch with the rapidly changing underworld. Luciano, on the other hand, believed in streamlining the Mafia into a national syndicate, a coordinated network of criminal enterprises where money and strategy, not ethnic pride or blind loyalty, ruled the day. This philosophical clash turned personal as tensions mounted during the Castellammarese War. While Masseria insisted on dragging his organization into a bloody and costly power struggle with Salvatore Maranzano, Luciano began to question whether his boss's actions were really about protecting the organization or just clinging to outdated authority. More and more, he saw Masseria not as a leader, but as a liability. The war, which had already claimed the lives of many, was draining resources and creating chaos, and Masseria refused to adapt or compromise. Behind the scenes, Luciano began building quiet relationships with former enemies, including Maranzano himself. He carefully positioned himself as the bridge between the old world and the new, someone who understood tradition but wasn't imprisoned by it. To the young generation of gangsters rising through the ranks, Luciano represented the future. Masseria, increasingly isolated, still believed he could demand total obedience, but he failed to realize that his old-school tactics were no longer enough in a world run by men who thought like businessmen, not warlords. As the Castellammarese War dragged on, the streets of New York turned into a battleground between Joe Masseria's aging faction and the rising forces of Salvatore Maranzano. But beneath the gunfire and shifting alliances, a far more subtle war was being waged, one of ideology, ambition, and survival. At the heart of this silent rebellion was Lucky Luciano, Masseria's trusted protege, who had grown increasingly disillusioned with his boss's rigid style, poor judgment, and refusal to adapt to the new realities of organized crime in America. Luciano understood that the Mafia needed structure, cooperation, and a national scope if it was to survive and thrive beyond prohibition. He believed in transforming the scattered, tribal Italian gangs into a streamlined, business-like syndicate. But Masseria, a relic of the old world, had no interest in such visions. He demanded loyalty without offering progress, issued orders without consultation, and led with fear instead of strategy. Luciano, ever calculating, began to see Masseria not as a mentor, but as an obstacle, a dangerous liability standing in the way of the future. So, while Masseria continued to fight the war as if it were a matter of honor and blood, Luciano quietly plotted his exit. He began communicating secretly with Salvatore Maranzano, the very man Masseria was hell-bent on destroying. Though Maranzano shared many old-world traits with Masseria, he at least recognized Luciano's potential and promised him a central role in the restructured Mafia landscape. Luciano, ever pragmatic, agreed to switch sides, on one condition: Masseria had to be removed permanently. The betrayal was calculated, deliberate, and executed with chilling precision. Luciano knew Masseria's habits, routines, and weaknesses. He also understood the symbolic importance of his boss's death, not just as a tactical blow to his organization, but as a declaration that a new era was dawning. The execution had to be clean, public enough to send a message, and irreversible. On April 15, 1931, Luciano lured Masseria to a quiet lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a modest restaurant on Coney Island. To Masseria, it was just another casual meeting with his trusted lieutenant, a chance to talk business, relax, and escape the tension of the ongoing war. But to Luciano, it was the final act in a carefully choreographed betrayal. The two men played cards, ate seafood, and shared wine, as they had countless times before. Masseria had no idea that Luciano had already made arrangements for his assassination and would soon excuse himself from the table, leaving his boss alone, unarmed, and vulnerable. Outside, waiting in the shadows, were several gunmen, loyal not to Masseria, but to Luciano's cause. The betrayal was not just a murder. It was a symbolic execution of an era. Masseria had once been the most powerful mafia boss in New York. Now, in the span of minutes, he was about to become a memory, a casualty of progress, consumed by the very system he had tried to dominate with fear and tradition. Joe Masseria's assassination in 1931 was not just another gangland murder. It was a turning point, the final blow that ended one age of organized crime and ushered in another. His death symbolized the collapse of the old Sicilian mafia structure in America, which had been built on rigid tradition, regional loyalty, and brutal authoritarianism. In many ways, Masseria represented a dying breed of mobster, one who saw leadership as domination, who refused to modernize, and who valued bloodlines over brains. When he fell, so too did the world he had fought so ruthlessly to preserve. For over a decade, Masseria had ruled New York's underworld with an iron fist. His influence stretched through gambling operations, bootlegging rings, extortion rackets, and political bribery. He controlled neighborhoods, families, and entire industries by sheer force. But he lacked a vision for the future. While his enemies evolved and adapted to the new world of organized crime brought on by prohibition and the rise of national networks, Masseria remained stuck in the past, obsessed with personal power and incapable of forming alliances that extended beyond his narrow ethnic circle. His murder, orchestrated by Lucky Luciano and sanctioned by Salvatore Maranzano, sent shockwaves through the underworld. It was more than a betrayal. It was a calculated demolition of the old order. With Masseria out of the picture, the violent Castellamarese war came to a swift and bloody conclusion. Salvatore Maranzano declared himself the Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses, attempting to step into the vacuum of leadership Masseria left behind. But even that title wouldn't last long. Luciano had bigger plans. In the months following Masseria's death, Luciano and a new generation of mobsters would dismantle the outdated hierarchical system of the past. They introduced a more corporate structure to the mafia, dividing the underworld into 5 families, creating a commission to mediate disputes, and building a nationwide criminal syndicate that operated like a boardroom more than a battlefield. This was the beginning of what many refer to as the modern mafia, and its foundations were laid on the ruins of Masseria's empire. Masseria's downfall became a warning to those who refused to evolve. His stubbornness, his obsession with power, and his inability to trust the changing tides cost him everything. He had once sat atop the criminal food chain, feared and obeyed, but in the end, he became a victim of his own rigidity, a relic swept away by a younger, smarter, and more ruthless generation. Joe Masseria's life and death serve as a powerful lesson in the evolution of organized crime. His ruthless reign marked a time when power was maintained through fear and tradition, but it also showed the limits of resisting change. The violent struggle he was part of reshaped the mafia forever, giving rise to a new era led by visionaries like Lucky Luciano, men who understood that survival meant adapting, innovating, and thinking beyond old loyalties. Though Masseria's name may be remembered for violence and betrayal, his story is inseparable from the birth of the modern American mafia. His downfall was not just the fall of one man, but the end of an age and the beginning of a new chapter in criminal history that would influence America's underworld for decades to come.